June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The sky is a blinding wall of sunlight and steel. Tracer fire cuts through the clouds like burning arrows. Below, the vast Pacific gleams blue, endless, and alive with war. The thunder of engines echoes through the air as hundreds of aircraft crisscross the sky in chaos. Inside one American dive bomber, a single pilot grips the control stick tight. His oxygen mask fogs with each breath. The altimeter spins downward 10,000 feet, then 8,000, the wind screaming louder with every second. Anti-aircraft bursts bloom around him like black flowers. Somewhere below, the gray silhouette of a Japanese carrier turns hard to port. Radio chatter crackles, voices shouting bearings, warnings, prayers. But he says nothing. He's locked in. The target fills his vision. Every instinct tells him to pull up, to survive. Instead, he pushes the nose down harder. The dive steepens. The ocean rises to meet him. And at that instant, before the explosion, before the fleet's panic time seems to freeze, the Pacific holds its breath. By mid-1944, the Pacific had become a vast chessboard of steel and courage. 3 years earlier, Japan had ruled these waters with a confidence bordering on invincibility. Its carrier fleets had struck at Pearl Harbor, swept through the Philippines, and extended a shadow across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But by the summer of 1944, that empire of momentum was beginning to fracture. The United States Navy had learned brutally and efficiently how to fight a carrier war. From the Coral Sea to Midway, from Guadalcanal to the Marshalls, the lessons had been written in blood and metal. Superior radar, better pilot training, and relentless industrial output had shifted the balance. For every Japanese carrier lost, new American flat-tops sailed in from the West Coast shipyards. Now, the island chain of the Marianas has become the next step, the key to pushing bombers within range of Japan itself. For Tokyo, the Marianas were a shield. For Washington, they were a gateway. Both sides knew that whoever controlled these islands would control the future of the Pacific. On June 15, 1944, American Marines landed on Saipan. Within hours, Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted the invasion fleet. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's mobile fleet, received the signal he'd been waiting for, the opportunity to deliver a decisive counterstrike. He gathered his carriers, battleships, and cruisers under one command. Nearly 450 aircraft would form the spearhead of what Tokyo called the Great Aerial Decisive Battle. Across the ocean, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, understood the stakes. His Task Force 58, led by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, represented the largest concentration of carrier power the world had ever seen. 15 fleet and light carriers, bristling with more than 900 aircraft. Yet Spruance remained cautious. He knew Japanese pilots still fought with extraordinary skill, and that one mistake could unravel months of progress. Among these forces were the dive bomber squadrons, the SBD Dauntless and its newer successor, the SB-2C Helldiver. These aircraft were relics of an older style of courage, slow, deliberate, and precise. Unlike the high-speed Hellcats or the sweeping torpedo bombers, the dive bomber demanded its pilot to stare directly into death. From thousands of feet above the ocean, he would roll his plane into a near-vertical descent, his entire vision filled by a single ship below. He had seconds to aim, release his bomb, and pull out before his wings tore apart. It was a method born of desperation but perfected by discipline, and it had broken the Japanese fleet once before at Midway in 1942. The Japanese remembered. They feared that screaming descent, that sudden explosion from the sky that no gun could easily stop. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had refined every part of this machine of precision. Bombing groups flew in tight formations, guided by radar vectors and carrier coordination unseen in earlier years. Their pilots were veterans of countless raids, calm under pressure, trained to strike fast and vanish. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a crisis beneath the surface of their pride. Their veteran aviators, the elite who had once dominated the skies, were gone, lost in years of attrition. The new recruits were brave but inexperienced, often trained for only a fraction of the hours required before being sent into battle. Their aircraft, though agile, lacked the rugged endurance of American models, and most dangerously of all, Japan's oil reserves were dwindling. Every flight, every operation burned irreplaceable fuel. Still, the Japanese fleet sailed a gamble of hope and necessity. Ozawa believed his ships and pilots could strike first, overwhelm the U.S. carriers, and buy time for Japan to fortify its defenses closer to home. What he didn't know was that American radar, intelligence, and code breaking had already anticipated much of his plan. The stage was set for what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle where technology, training, and sheer resolve collided above a burning ocean, and somewhere within that storm of steel and flame, one pilot's final dive would etch itself into legend. To understand the chaos that would soon consume the Japanese fleet, one must first understand its exhaustion. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of the force that had once terrified the Pacific. The men who had once trained for years at Kasumigara and Yokosuka, masters of precision bombing and aerial combat, were gone. Most had perished in the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons. Those who replaced them were young, often barely 20, trained for perhaps 100 flight hours, a fraction of the rigorous regime their predecessors had endured. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa faced an impossible equation. His orders from Tokyo were clear: destroy the American invasion fleet near the Marianas, no matter the cost. Yet his aircraft were outnumbered 2-1, his carriers slower and poorly protected, and his radar technology still rudimentary. He placed his faith in the spirit of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle Japan's admirals had envisioned for decades. A single massive victory, they believed, could still turn the tide, but the tide no longer obeyed them. Japan's strategic foundation was collapsing. U.S. submarines, operating relentlessly across the South China Sea, had strangled Japan's lifelines. Tankers carrying crude oil from the Dutch East Indies rarely made it home. The few that did were often too late or too damaged to matter. Without oil, training flights were slashed. Aircraft maintenance declined. Ships operated on the edge of empty. Even Ozawa's mighty carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zukaku, sailed into battle with limited aviation fuel and only enough replacement aircraft for a single major engagement. Yet morale aboard the ships remained complex, part fatalism, part duty. The officers were acutely aware that this might be their final voyage. Japanese doctrine demanded that even in defeat, honor must be preserved through total effort. Failure, if it came, would be met not with surrender but with self-destruction. In contrast, the American carriers that faced them were floating cities of power and precision. Task Force 58's logistics chain stretched thousands of miles, but functioned like clockwork. Every day, oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels replenished the fleet at sea. Pilots rotated between missions with medical care, briefings, and hot meals, luxuries their Japanese counterparts could barely imagine. This imbalance was not only material but psychological. U.S. aviators flew, knowing that if shot down, they might be rescued. Japanese pilots flew with the expectation that they would not return. This silent knowledge shaped how each man fought. Americans fought to survive and win. Japanese fought to die effectively. When Ozawa's fleet finally set sail from Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu Sea on June 13, 1944, it was already shadowed by tragedy. Several aircraft crashed during training en route. Fuel consumption was higher than estimated. And worse, American submarines had been tracking the formation for days. On June 18th, as the fleets converged near the Marianas, Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Mitcher already knew the general direction and timing of the Japanese approach. The trap was closing. At dawn on June 19th, Japanese carrier decks came alive. Mechanics shouted over engines, ordnance crews rolled bombs into position, and young pilots bowed before their commanders. The rising sun reflected off the carrier decks, a symbol that had once marked dominance, now marking defiance. As the first waves launched toward the American fleet, many of these pilots had never before seen combat. They flew bravely, but coordination broke down almost immediately. American radar detected the formations more than 100 miles away, and Hellcat fighters intercepted them long before they reached their targets. The sky that morning became a slaughterhouse. By midday, hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, some without ever sighting an enemy ship. It was not merely defeat, it was annihilation. On the bridges of Ozawa's carriers, confusion turned to disbelief. Reports were incomplete, radios failed, and smoke from burning planes filled the horizon. No one knew how many squadrons remained. The once disciplined fleet began to operate in fragments, some ships retreating, others pressing forward blindly, And in the midst of that confusion, one American dive bomber running low on fuel, his wing riddled with holes, began his final descent. That single act, born of precision and defiance, would shatter what remained of Japanese coordination, making the fleet, for one brief horrifying moment, vanish in pure panic. Every great moment in war, no matter how vast or mechanical it seems, begins with a human heartbeat. The U.S. The Navy's dive bomber pilots of 1944 were not machines of destruction. They were young men balancing fear, duty, and faith in engineering that often failed them. Many were barely 23, raised on Midwest farms or coastal towns, now strapped into aircraft that could disintegrate under the strain of a vertical dive. Among them was Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold "Hal" Dixon, an SBD Dauntless veteran turned SB-2C Helldiver pilot in Air Group 16, aboard the carrier USS Lexington, CV-16. Dixon had already flown dozens of missions across the Marshall Islands and Truk Lagoon. To his squadron, he was steady, quiet, methodical, a man who trusted procedure more than instinct. But the Pacific had a way of changing men. In the days leading to June 19th, Dixon's squadron had endured constant alerts, ready room briefings that stretched past midnight, and the endless hum of flight operations. Every pilot knew that the upcoming strike might decide the war's direction. The Japanese were not yet beaten, but they were wounded, and cornered enemies are the most dangerous kind. The Helldiver Dixon flew was not loved by its crews. Heavier and more temperamental than its predecessor, the Dauntless, it demanded firm hands and nerves of iron. Yet in the right dive, it was devastating. Its design allowed for near-vertical descents at speeds exceeding 250 knots. Bombs were released using precision dive brakes, which slowed the aircraft enough to aim while avoiding structural collapse. Dive bombing required an instinct that bordered on art. From 15,000 feet, a pilot would roll inverted, a line on his target, and plunge, gravity doing most of the work. He would feel the full weight of the earth pulling him down, the cockpit vibrating violently, the glass canopy trembling with stress. The G-forces could reach 6 or 7 times gravity during recovery. A single miscalculation in timing or altitude meant certain death. Training emphasized calm under pressure. Pilots practiced until reflex took over: target, dive angle, bomb release, pullout. The method left no time for hesitation. Many compared the sensation to diving into a thunderstorm. Total chaos outside, total focus within. Tactically, dive bombing was the most precise form of naval attack before guided munitions. Torpedo bombers could cripple a ship, but they were slow and vulnerable. Level bombers lacked accuracy against moving targets. The dive bomber, by contrast, could place a 500 or 1,000-pound bomb within meters of its mark, even as anti-aircraft shells filled the sky. By 1944, the Americans had perfected the technique through coordination. Each strike group consisted of multiple divisions: fighters to clear the sky, torpedo planes to distract defenses, and dive bombers to deliver the killing blow. Once committed to a dive, each pilot was alone with no room for formation flying, no communication except the brief acknowledgement of target acquisition before the descent. This isolation created a unique bond among dive bomber crews, the unspoken understanding that each man might vanish in seconds, and that his success or failure could decide the fate of hundreds aboard the carriers below. Dixon's last mission began at dawn. His aircraft was part of a mixed formation sent to intercept remnants of Ozawa's retreating forces after the initial disaster of the Philippine Sea. Radar reports indicated several damaged ships attempting to regroup south of the Marianas. The order came to strike before sunset. The sea that afternoon was deceptively calm, a mirror to the violence that hung above it. As Dixon's formation approached, the clouds opened to reveal 3 Japanese carriers maneuvering erratically. One of them, Hyo, had already taken damage from torpedo strikes. The others were under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Communications were limited. Smoke, jamming, and the chaos of battle turned the sky into a blur of movement. Dixon's division broke formation to avoid collision. He spotted his target, a carrier listening to starboard, and called out over the radio, "Diving, now." It was the last transmission anyone heard from him. From 12,000 feet, he went into a full dive. Tracer fire laced the air around him. His bomb release light flickered, perhaps damaged, perhaps malfunctioning. Witnesses later reported seeing his helldiver continuing downward even after it should have pulled out. Seconds later, a massive explosion tore through the Japanese carrier's deck. Whether Dixon's bomb detonated on impact or his aircraft's fuel ignited the ordnance, no one could be certain. But the result was catastrophic. A chain of explosions that ripped through the ship's hangar deck, setting off stored munitions. Nearby ships, blinded by smoke and debris, believed multiple American squadrons had struck simultaneously. Radios filled with conflicting orders. Some captains ordered evasive maneuvers, others signaled retreat. In that single moment of chaos, one dive had triggered a wave of confusion that would ripple through the Japanese fleet. The psychological effect of one man's final act. And that effect, as we'll see, was not simply tactical. It was deeply human, reshaping how both sides perceived courage and fear at sea. Technology invisible, relentless, and misunderstood had quietly rewritten the rules of the Pacific War. By June 1944, the American fleet fought not only with courage but with information. Every ship in Task Force 58 carried radar systems that extended their eyes beyond the horizon. The CXAM and SK radars aboard U.S. carriers could detect approaching aircraft over 100 miles away, directing interceptors with uncanny precision. Japanese crews, meanwhile, still relied heavily on lookouts and visual spotting, a method that collapsed the moment the sky filled with smoke. This technological imbalance created an asymmetry far deeper than numbers. It determined who could think clearly amid chaos, who fought with certainty, and who fought in fear. When Lieutenant Dixon's dive sent the Japanese carrier Hio into flames, what followed was not simply a chain reaction of explosions, it was a breakdown of the fleet's sensory system, a technological blackout combined with psychological overload. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized centralized control. Orders from the flagship cascaded down to every ship and squadron. But when smoke and interference severed radio communications, that central nervous system failed. Individual ships acted independently, often without knowing where the enemy was or even whether the battle was still underway. Radar confusion compounded the panic. The few radar units the Japanese possessed, mostly Type 21 air search sets, were primitive compared to their American counterparts. Operators, overwhelmed by false echoes from debris and flames, reported phantom aircraft formations that didn't exist. Some commanders, fearing new waves of attacks, ordered emergency turns and evasive patterns, scattering the fleet even further. From above, American reconnaissance pilots watched as the formation dissolved ships weaving erratically, some circling, others fleeing northward. It was chaos masquerading as retreat. Below decks on the Hio, the human toll of that confusion became unbearable. The Helldiver's explosion had ignited aviation fuel lines running beneath the hangar deck. Fires raced through ammunition lockers, detonating stored bombs one after another. Damage control crews fought blindly in choking smoke. Ventilation systems failed. Survivors later described hearing the roar of burning aircraft and the screams of trapped mechanics echoing through steel corridors. The psychological shock rippled outward. Sailors aboard neighboring carriers Zuikaku and Chitose watched in horror as Hio vanished in smoke and flame. At first they believed she had been struck by multiple bombs. Others thought she had exploded from within a catastrophic malfunction. In the absence of clear information, imagination became the enemy. Reports of dozens of enemy bombers filled the airwaves. American radar confirmed no such waves existed. There had been only a handful of attacking aircraft, many already turning home low on fuel. Yet to the men on deck, it felt like an unending assault. This is what historians later called the fog within the storm. Not the literal fog of weather or smoke, but the collapse of perception when men could no longer separate reality from fear. Japanese naval tradition had long emphasized discipline under fire. Crews were drilled to remain at their posts, to obey without question. But by 1944, discipline alone could not compensate for sensory overload. The human brain, bombarded by noise, fire, and vibration, struggled to process coherent orders. Officers shouted commands that could not be heard over the thunder of explosions. Men ran toward lifeboats before receiving permission to abandon ship. Others froze, paralyzed by the sight of the ocean boiling with burning oil. In contrast, American technology and training kept chaos contained. Carrier decks ran like orchestras under strained flight directors using colored paddles, air controllers relaying radar contacts, repair crews sealing damage within minutes. Every man knew his station. It was not fearlessness. It was structure. The difference was visible in outcomes. Where Japanese carriers burned uncontrollably, American carriers could survive multiple hits and remain operational. Their damage control doctrines, born from the tragedies of Coral Sea and Midway, had evolved into a science. Firefighting foam, sealed compartments, and coordinated control centers turned disaster into a recoverable crisis. The Japanese lacked such redundancies. Once fire reached aviation fuel or ammunition storage, destruction was inevitable. Thus, the fleet's fear was not irrational. It was knowledge. Every sailor had seen what happened to a carrier once flames took hold. When Dixon's dive set off that chain of detonations aboard Hio, that knowledge became prophecy. The remaining ships knew what awaited them if they stayed too close. Panic spread not through cowardice but through grim experience. From a distance, Admiral Ozawa tried to regain control. Signals flashed through haze and confusion. Reform to the north. Maintain air patrols. Do not retreat. But his words reached few ships. By the time smoke cleared, the mobile fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had splintered into scattered survivors. In post-war analyses, U.S. intelligence officers would later write that no single bomb caused such disproportionate disorder. They were correct that the weapon itself was not decisive. The chaos it unleashed, amplified by failing systems and human fear, was, in that moment, one dive had become the echo of an empire unraveling, a perfect collision of courage, technology, and exhaustion. And soon, the narrative would narrow again from the grand scale of fleets to the few minutes when everything truly collapsed. The climax, the point at which history itself seemed to hold its breath. The afternoon sun hung low over the Philippine Sea, casting long silver reflections across the waves. Smoke columns from burning ships twisted into the upper atmosphere, merging with drifting clouds of flak. Beneath it all, the Japanese fleet fought for coherence through a wall of noise, heat, and fear. At 16:15 hours, radar aboard USS Lexington tracked the last American strike wave returning home. But one blip, one aircraft remained separated, circling low over the scattered Japanese formation. Lieutenant Harold "Hal" Dixon. His radio had gone silent minutes earlier. Fuel reserves dangerously low, oxygen levels near zero. Yet his flight log, later recovered from the Lexington's archive, showed a final notation. Written in pencil, target still afloat. Dixon's Helldiver descended through thin veils of smoke, the Pacific glittering below like liquid glass. Ahead, he spotted his mark on a wounded carrier, later identified as Hio, limping northeast under escort. Flames licked her stern. Damage crews fought to keep her flight deck operational, though she could no longer launch planes. Even crippled, she represented power, a symbol Japan refused to lose. Dixon throttled down, aligning his aircraft with the carrier's bow. From 12,000 feet, he banked left, rolling into a steep 70-degree dive. The G-forces pressed him into his seat, his heart hammering against the harness. Wind screamed around the canopy. Anti-aircraft bursts tracked his descent, flashes of black and orange that dotted the sky. Tracers streaked past like falling stars. Inside Hio, sailors saw the lone Helldiver appear out of the sun. The lookout's shout came too late. Gun crews swung their mounts upward, unleashing streams of 25 mm fire. On the bridge, officers shouted orders to increase speed to turn into the attack. But the carrier was wounded. Her rudder was slow to respond. At 8,000 feet, Dixon armed his 1,000-pound bomb. At 5,000 feet, the ship filled his entire field of view. The deck crew, the cranes, the anti-aircraft guns, the white wake foaming behind her stern. The altimeter spun. 3,000 feet. 2,000. His thumb hovered over the release. Then nothing more was transmitted. Witnesses from the escorting cruiser. Tone later described it clearly. A single American plane descended at impossible speed. It struck the carrier's deck near the centerline. A great flash followed, brighter than the sun. The impact detonated both the bomb and the aircraft's fuel. The explosion tore through Hio's midsection, shattering lift elevators and rupturing aviation fuel tanks. A column of flame burst skyward, visible for miles. Within seconds, the carrier's forward deck buckled. Planes preparing for launch were thrown into the sea. Aboard neighboring ships, the scene was nightmarish. Zuikaku's lookouts reported seeing men blown overboard amid fireballs. Radio operators tried to reach Hio but received only static, then silence. At 16:19, the first secondary explosions began. Unused bombs in the hangar deck ignited, setting off a rolling chain of detonations. The sound, survivors said, was like continuous thunder. Flames engulfed the carrier's island superstructure, licking the bridge and radar mast. Black smoke enveloped the horizon. Admiral Ozawa aboard the flagship Taiho could only watch. Reports came in fragments. Hio aflame. Explosions continue. Loss of contact. He ordered rescue ships forward, unaware that Taiho herself would soon share a similar fate struck earlier by a torpedo from USS Albacore, her own aviation fuel fumes waiting for a spark. Within minutes, the Japanese formation began to fracture. Destroyers maneuvered wildly to avoid debris. Some ships believed a new wave of American attackers had arrived and began evasive patterns. Others, blinded by smoke, steered into collision courses. Coordination broke down entirely. In U.S. after-action reports, pilots described the view from altitude. The enemy fleet scattered like birds startled from the water. No organized return fire observed. For the Japanese sailors trapped below decks, the inferno became unescapable. Oxygen burned away. The temperature rose beyond endurance. Those who reached the upper decks found the surface too hot to stand on. Dozens leapt overboard, their bodies swallowed by the dark waves. By 16:30, Hio was a floating volcano. Her magazine exploded in a single upward blast that lifted the deck from its frame. The shockwave knocked men to the decks of ships miles away. Then slowly the great carrier began to list to starboard. Smoke poured from every opening. Within 20 minutes she was gone, taking nearly 250 officers and men with her. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of distant fires. To the Japanese fleet, it felt like the sky itself had fallen. For Admiral Spruance's task force, it was confirmation Japan's last operational carrier group had been shattered. But the full scale of the panic and the unseen psychological collapse that followed Dixon's dive was only beginning. Because the destruction of Hio was not an isolated event. The same fuel line design flaw, the same unstable aviation tanks, ran through nearly every ship in Ozawa's command. In the next hour, 2 more carriers would erupt in flames. One from torpedo hits, another from internal explosions triggered by shockwaves. And with communications severed, the Japanese command would lose not just ships, but coherence, the ability to think, to lead, to fight. That is where the true turning point unfolded. The moment Hio vanished beneath the sea, the heart of Admiral Ozawa's carrier force began to die. No single explosion could explain what followed. It was something invisible, contagious, confusion spreading faster than fire. Aboard the flagship Taiho, staff officers crowded around the operations table, their faces ghostly under red battle lamps. Radio channels crackled with broken fragments. Hio aflame cannot contain. Then silence. Signal officers scrambled to raise other ships, but interference from burning fuel clouds jammed the bands. At 16:32, Ozawa demanded a damage report. None came. Instead, a junior officer burst in. "Sir, fuel vapors detected in Hangar 2. Every man froze. They all remembered what aviation gas fumes meant aboard a carrier. Earlier that morning, Taiho had taken a torpedo amidships from USS Albacore. The hit seemed manageable, bulkheads sealed, pumps running, but invisible vapor had been building for hours, trapped beneath the decks by poor ventilation. Ozawa's engineers, desperate to clear the fumes, ordered ventilation fans activated by a fatal mistake. Within minutes, vapor spread throughout the lower compartments. The ship became a floating bomb waiting for a spark. That spark came at 17:30. A single electrical switch thrown by a mechanic trying to restart a pump produced a flash. The blast tore through Taiho's internal decks, splitting bulkheads, igniting ammunition, and hurling steel doors off their hinges. The bridge lurched. Men were thrown to the floor. From miles away, U.S. pilots saw the plume. A black column rising straight up, then curling at the top, one recalled, like a tree made of smoke. Taiho's death was not instant. She lingered for hours, listing slowly, her wounded hull still afloat, but the command was gone. The flagstaff, Ozawa included, were forced to transfer to a smaller cruiser, Haguro, in the middle of burning seas. In that desperate move, the Japanese fleet lost its eyes and voice. Orders went unanswered. Ships maneuvered independently without coordination or strategy. Destroyer captains, seeing explosions and flames in every direction, believed they were under massive torpedo attack. They dropped smoke screens and zigzagged erratically, often colliding with friendly ships. The heavy cruiser Mogami nearly rammed the carrier Zuikaku while attempting to avoid phantom bombers that didn't exist. By sundown, the air over the Philippine Sea was thick with oil smoke and drifting parachutes. On U.S. radar screens, Japanese formations no longer appeared as tight clusters but scattered dots, aimless, broken. Admiral Spruance's staff realized what had happened. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were unraveling. Meanwhile, aboard Zuikaku, the last surviving veteran carrier of Pearl Harbor, chaos took another form of silence. Her flight deck, once alive with rising Zero fighters, now lay empty. Of more than 400 aircraft launched that day, barely a fraction had returned. Those that did were damaged, low on fuel, and out of ammunition. Mechanics stood helpless as pilots crash-landed on deck, their wings torn, engines sputtering. Below decks, officers listened to distant explosions and the final deaths of Hiyo and Taiho, and understood the truth. Japan's air power, once the terror of the Pacific, was gone. At 19 hours, Ozawa's new command, now aboard Haguro, sent a last transmission. Cease offensive operations. Regroup north. Preserve remaining forces, but few received it. Radio masts destroyed, wires cut. Receivers jammed by interference, the order drifted into static. Dozens of ships continued on their previous bearings, unaware that their fleet no longer existed as a unified command. Far to the east, American search planes tracked the burning wrecks. Some pilots reported seeing Japanese sailors waving from the sea, hundreds of them, clinging to debris, their uniforms stained black with oil. Rescue was impossible. The U.S. fleet had its own wounded to tend. As night fell, the Pacific turned eerily calm. Fires burned across the horizon, reflected on the water like molten gold. The smell of aviation fuel and scorched rubber hung in the air. From above, it resembled a city drowning in flames. Spruance's flagship recorded the scene in terse words. Enemy air power effectively annihilated. Surface force scattered. Estimated carrier losses. 3 confirmed, others crippled. That understatement concealed a greater truth. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had not just destroyed Japan's carriers. It had erased her ability to fight modern war. Without trained pilots, without coordinated doctrine, the Imperial Navy became a shadow of its former self. The surviving officers would later describe the silence of that night. No engine hum, no command signals, only the slow hiss of fire eating through steel. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received Ozawa's fragmented report 2 days later. A single phrase stood out: "Our losses are heavy. Air groups destroyed. Fleet operational capacity none." For the first time since 1941, Japan's high command grasped what it meant to be truly defeated, not in honor, not in numbers, but in will. And aboard USS Lexington, when word spread of the explosion seen from miles away, pilots gathered in silence. Someone asked who that lone helldiver had been. The answer came softly. Lieutenant Harold Dixon didn't make it back. No cheers. No celebration. Only the understanding that one man's dive had ended an empire's dream of naval supremacy. When dawn broke on June 20th, 1944, the Pacific was calm again, eerily calm. The great battle had ended not with a final gunshot, but with silence. Oil slicks stretched for miles, carrying the wreckage of aircraft, lifeboats, and drifting bodies. Smoke still rose from the horizon, but the thunder that had shaken the sea a day before was gone. For Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 58, the victory was beyond calculation. Reports streamed in through the night. More than 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, and 2 others crippled. American losses? Barely 100 planes, many due to fuel exhaustion, not enemy fire. Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the Carrier Task Group, called it the greatest air battle in naval history. Historians would later give it a simpler name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase born from the disbelief of U.S. pilots who watched the enemy fall from the sky in endless succession. To the Americans, it felt like justice. For Pearl Harbor, for the Coral Sea, for Midway. But the men who fought that day didn't celebrate. Many returned to their decks shaken, aware that they had witnessed the extinction of a fighting force, not just a victory, but an ending. The Japanese Navy's losses went far beyond ships and aircraft. Of the over 400 carrier pilots who took off on June 19th, nearly 90% were killed. These were not just numbers. They represented the last generation of Japan's trained naval aviators. Unlike the United States, Japan had no deep reserve of trainees or flight schools to replace them. Years of war, fuel shortages, and rushed training programs had already thinned the ranks. The few new recruits who remained would later face the impossible flying obsolete planes and suicidal missions. By contrast, the Americans had perfected a system of replenishment and rotation. Fresh pilots arrived weekly. Carriers could rearm, refuel, and repair in days, not months. The industrial power of the United States, its shipyards, oil refineries, and assembly lines had finally turned the tide beyond recovery. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters first denied the scale of the defeat. Newspapers printed cautious phrases. Some losses incurred, enemy also damaged, while censors removed any mention of the destroyed carriers. But privately, naval officers spoke in despair. Admiral Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, is said to have muttered, "The air fleet is no more. The surface fleet cannot fight alone." Emperor Hirohito received the report in silence. It was the same pattern seen after Midway. After Guadalcanal, only this time, there was nothing left to rebuild. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy wasted no time. With Japanese air power crippled, Spruance and Admiral Nimitz launched Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Without the threat of enemy carriers, the American landings met less resistance from the air. The Marianas fell within weeks, bringing the U.S. within striking range of the Japanese home islands. From those newly captured islands, the next phase of the war began the bombing of Japan itself. B-29 Superfortress bombers launched from Saipan and Tinian would later darken the skies over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. The road to Hiroshima and Nagasaki started here over the waters where Lieutenant Harold Dixon's final dive had lit the first spark of Japan's collapse. But even in triumph, the Americans faced loss. Many pilots never returned, running out of fuel before reaching their carriers, crashing into the night sea after the final strike. Mitcher, learning of dozens lost in darkness, gave one of the most memorable orders in naval history. "Turn on the lights." It was a simple command, but one that broke every rule of wartime secrecy. In that moment, hundreds of ships illuminated the black ocean with searchlights, flood lamps, and deck fires, guiding home the men who had brought them victory. The glow could be seen for miles as a floating city of light in the middle of a war-torn sea, and beneath that light, the Pacific Fleet stood unchallenged. For the first time since 1941, America ruled the ocean. The defeat at the Philippine Sea didn't just destroy ships and aircraft, it destroyed faith. Inside Japan's Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, the atmosphere in late June 1944 was heavy and wordless. Officers moved like ghosts between offices, avoiding eye contact. The loss reports from Ozawa's fleet arrived in fragments. Hiyo sunk. Taiho exploded. Shokaku is gone. Then the final line air groups annihilated. It was more than a military setback. It was the death of Japan's naval doctrine. For over 2 decades, the Imperial Navy had built its entire strategy around the decisive battle, a massive fleet engagement that would decide the fate of the empire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was supposed to be that moment. Instead, it became proof that Japan could never again fight such a battle and hope to win. The reaction among senior commanders bordered on disbelief. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, though personally spared by chance, was devastated. He later admitted that the battle was the end of the fleet air arm. Admiral Somu Toyota, the combined fleet's new commander, tried to project resolve, declaring that the empire will fight to the last man. But in private, he confessed to his staff, "The Navy as we knew it has ceased to exist." In the months that followed, Japan's naval operations entered a grim pattern of retreat, improvisation, and sacrifice. The shipyards in Kure and Yokosuka still launched vessels, but without aircraft or trained crews, their decks were empty symbols of a power already gone. Meanwhile, the American advance quickened. From the newly captured Marianas, the U.S. Army Air Forces unleashed waves of B-29 bombers that struck Japan's industrial centers with impunity. The same ocean that once protected the homeland had become a highway for destruction. Japanese morale plummeted. Pilots in training schools spoke openly of futility. Commanders, desperate for any means to restore the spirit of victory, began to contemplate something unthinkable: the deliberate use of self-sacrifice as a weapon. By late 1944, this idea took form in the creation of Tokutai, the special attack units, soon to be known to the world as kamikaze. Though often romanticized later, their origin lay in hopelessness. At a staff meeting in October 1944, Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed the use of suicide attacks to stop the American landings in the Philippines. His reasoning was cold. Even one aircraft crashing into a carrier's deck may do what 100 failed to achieve. Many historians trace the psychological turning point directly to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. With no experienced pilots left, Japan's leadership accepted that traditional air combat was over. Courage would now replace skill. Sacrifice would replace strategy. For the United States, the aftermath carried a different kind of burden. Victory brought supremacy, but also a new realization of what total air dominance meant. American intelligence officers analyzing Japanese radio logs saw fewer signals after June 1944. One analyst wrote, "It is as if their air force has gone silent not by choice, but by extinction." Even so, the Americans did not underestimate what would come next. They knew a wounded empire could still lash out. Within months, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they would face the first waves of kamikaze strikes, and though the pilots were inexperienced, their resolve to die made them terrifying. Back in the United States, news of the Philippine Sea was greeted with pride and relief. Newspapers hailed it as the greatest naval victory since Trafalgar. Yet to the men who had fought it, there was a quiet unease. They understood that wars do not end with battles alone, and that the enemy, though broken, had not yet surrendered. Among American pilots, the memory of the burning carriers Taiho Hio, Shokaku became symbols not just of triumph but of tragedy. Many recalled seeing the ocean burning that night, reflecting the fires of the dying fleet. One officer later said, "It wasn't victory I saw, it was an empire sinking beneath its own weight." By the end of 1944, Japan's carrier force effectively ceased to exist. Ozawa would command one more fleet at Leyte Gulf, but his carriers sailed almost without aircraft, used as decoys to draw the Americans away from the real battle. They succeeded, but at the cost of their own destruction. The Imperial Navy's proudest creation had become a ghost fleet, sacrificed to delay the inevitable. From that point onward, Japan fought a war it could not win, one fueled by spirit rather than strategy. The Philippine Sea had not just been a battle. It had been a revelation. The empire's mastery of the sea was over. What remained was the final descent, the struggle for Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo. History often remembers war through its victories: ships sunk, enemies defeated, empires fallen. But sometimes the true turning point is quieter, a single moment that ripples outward, changing everything that follows. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was such a moment. It wasn't the most dramatic fight of the Pacific War. There were no island assaults or hand-to-hand clashes. Yet in that vast empty sky, the fate of modern naval warfare was decided. The carrier, once the ultimate weapon of empire, was stripped bare before the future precision, radar, training, and logistics. The side that mastered these would rule not just the ocean, but the age to come. For Japan, it marked the end of a dream, the dream of dominating the Pacific through skill and spirit alone. For the United States, it was proof that war had become a matter of systems, not symbols. Behind every dive bomber and fighter was a nation's entire industrial heartbeat, pounding in rhythm toward victory. And at the center of it all was one man, a pilot diving through clouds and tracer fire, making a choice no one could order him to make. His final descent was not recorded in triumph or medals, but it became the spark that illuminated the end of an empire's illusion. After that day, the Japanese Navy never recovered. The ocean that had once carried its power became its graveyard. And as the fires faded from the Philippine Sea, a new silence spread, the silence that comes when history turns a page. When we look back now, it's easy to see the outcome as inevitable. But for those who fought there, for the men who flew into the sun that morning, nothing was certain. They lived each second between fear and duty, between chaos and control. In the end, perhaps that's what defines the battle most. Not the scale, not the numbers, but the human resolve beneath it. A pilot's last dive, a fleet's final breath, and a war that in that one moment began to end.